Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. During our last video, which came out a couple of weeks ago, we explored the topic of how do we know that God exists. There are plenty of modern atheists out there that try to insist there's no proof of the existence of God and that it's just a figment of the imagination. And what we did basically was to present what something commonly referred to as the argument of intelligent design. That when you take a look at the order and complexity of nature, logically it would lead you to the conclusion that there had to have been a designer behind it. It's sort of like if you go to the Louvre and you take a look at the Mona Lisa, the natural assumption is that something like that had to have been painted by a painter. And if you could make that kind of a conclusion about a simple two-dimensional object hanging on the wall in a museum, it would stand to reason that the universe as a whole, given its complexity and its structure and its order, had to have been created by somebody, an intelligent supreme being. And the way I like to put it is, the way St. Anselm put it, credo ut intelligam, I believe that I might understand. The reason why I believe the Bible is because it offers a far more satisfactory explanation of life and reality than any alternatives. And probably evolution or atheism is probably the worst possible alternative you can possibly imagine. It leaves you the problem is that once you remove God from the picture, it becomes very, very hard to come up with an alternative explanation that does justice to all of reality. And what typically happens in the case of atheism is that they wind up falling into two almost diametrically opposed tendencies or trends. And of course, here I'm going to speak a little bit in kind of broad, sweeping terms, and I realize there are individual atheists that I don't agree with this, and I don't agree with that, and that doesn't represent my position. But if you take a look at the history, trace the history of Western thought over the past couple of centuries, since the time of the French Enlightenment of the 18th century, you'll find that the secular viewpoints tend to swerve off into two totally opposite directions. One of them is what we might call rationalism. It's based on science, and it's the idea of naturalistic materialism. And then the other opposing viewpoint would be the idea that starts off with the autonomy of the human being, and it results in a kind of an irrational universe. I know I exist, but I don't know anything else exists, and you see that typically in modern existentialism and postmodernism. They wind up denying that there's even such a thing as truth. So what we want to do in this video is look at the first one. The kind of scientific rationalism that we find. And I want to begin by quoting from a book by Jerry Coyne entitled Why Evolution is True. And he goes through, he's a scientist, he knows a great deal about biology and so on. I think his overall arguments for evolution are kind of weak. But in the end, he winds up discussing some of the objections to it. And one of them is put out by somebody named Nancy Pearcey, who says that she's afraid to adopt a theory of evolution or accept it because of the effect that it would have on ethics. You know, that if we just evolve from lower forms of life through a blind, impersonal, natural process, it would leave us without any kind of an ethical or moral basis. And so Coyne responds to that this way. He says, Pearcey argues, and many American creationists agree, that all the perceived evils of evolution come from two worldviews that are part of science, naturalism and materialism. Naturalism is the view that the only way to understand our universe is through the scientific method. Materialism is the idea that the only reality is the physical matter of the universe, and that everything else, including thoughts, will, and emotions, come from physical laws acting on that matter. The message of evolution and all of science is one of naturalistic materialism. Darwinism tells us that, like all species, human beings arose from the working of blind, purposeless forces over eons of time. As far as we can determine, the same forces that gave rise to the ferns, mushrooms, lizards, and squirrels also produced us. And he then goes on to say, well, it can't exclude the possibility of supernatural explanation. But he says, we managed to understand the natural world just fine using reason and materialism. Okay, so far that seems to underscore Nancy Pearsall's objection. But then he goes on to say that Piercy's notion that these lessons of evolution will inevitably spill over into the study of ethics, history, and family life is unnecessarily alarming. How can you derive meaning, purpose, or ethics from evolution? You can't. Evolution is simply a theory about the process of human life's diversification, not a grand philosophical scheme about the meaning of life. But he had just gotten done saying earlier that naturalistic materialism is a philosophy of life. It's a worldview. So he's kind of contradicting himself. And what it boils down to is that either we were created by a supreme being or we weren't. And if God doesn't exist and we just came into existence through, blind impersonal natural process, if, as he says here, that materialism is the idea that the only reality is the physical matter of the universe, then that would leave you in basically an amoral universe. And it's very, very hard to see how in the world you can possibly establish any ethics. And then he goes on to admit that that evolution, the science cannot provide meaning, purpose, and ethics. Now, what that does then is it does leave open to there is a psychological approach to all of this, and it's called behaviorism, where you're trying to take a scientific approach to human behavior and human psychology. And one book that kind of stirred the waves back then, back in the 1960s, was entitled Beyond Freedom and Dignity by B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner was a behavior psychologist, and he says this: we can follow the path taken by physics and biology by turning directly to the relationship between behavior and the environment and neglecting supposed mediating states of mind. And so what he goes on then to basically say is that basically human behavior is determined by the environment. Okay, you're the product of your environment. And he says the social environment is your culture. So, for example, he says here, it is a matter of the good of the culture. And well, what he would say then is that basically the culture evolves the way supposedly biological evolution unfolds. It's a matter of natural survival. And the point that he's making here is that to understand to understand how this human behavior works, you have to think of it in terms of the cultural environment acting on individual human beings, and therefore, what's going to survive is what's good for the culture as a whole. So it's like he's taking the idea of natural selection and applying to human nature. But he says as a result, sometimes this idea of human dignity, freedom, and dignity has to be sacrificed for the common good. What's going to succeed in the long run, what's going to survive, is those cultures that are promoting the common good and not, our individual freedom. And of course, a little bit hard to wonder what he would think of modern American society, but he goes on to say that it is a matter of the good of the culture, not of the individual. Explicit design promotes that good by accelerating the evolutionary process. So in other words, it's not about preserving your personal freedom and autonomy and dignity. It's about doing what's going to cause the culture as a whole to survive. And so then he finally, at the end of the book, he comes down to a couple of conclusions here, where he says, in the scientific picture, a person is a member of a species shaped by evolutionary contingencies of survival, displaying behavioral processes which bring him under the control of the environment in which he lives, and largely under the control of a social environment which he and millions of others like him have constructed and maintained during the evolution of a culture. The direction of the controlling relation is reversed. A person does not act upon the world acts upon him. So basically, you're just a cog in the machine and the product of your environment, and it's not a matter of your individual thoughts and feelings. And then he goes on and draws his final conclusion when he says, an experimental analysis shifts the determination of behavior from autonomous man to the environment. an environment responsible both for the evolution of the species and for the repertoire acquired of each member. Early versions of environmentalism were inadequate because they could not explain how the environment worked, and much seemed to be left for autonomous man to do. But environmental contingencies now take over functions once attributed to autonomous man, and certain questions arise. Is man then abolished? Certainly not as a species or as an individual achiever. It is the autonomous inner man who is abolished, and that, he says, is a step forward. In other words, there's no such thing as an inward soul. You're just a thing being acted upon by your environment. You're a part of the species. You're part of your culture, and your culture is basically acting upon you for the survival of the culture as a whole. Now, I should mention that there are other varieties of this kind of naturalistic, materialistic kind of approach to reality. And one of them was Marxism, which kind of emphasizes economic determinism. Supposedly, according to Karl Marx, you had dialectical materialism, and there's this ongoing, your behavior is determined by economic factors, you're a part of this class struggle. That theory did get proven false, however, because history just did not turn out the way that the Marxists said it did. The proletariat did not rise up against the bourgeoisie and establish communist regimes. Instead, they joined labor unions. They decided to work within the capitalist system, and so that form of materialism kind of proved out to be false. But the problem with all of that, and if you're just looking at the physical universe, that might sort of seem kind of logical, but the problem is when you take a look at yourself as a human being, that you have an inner conscious self that tells you that you're more than just a hunk of protoplasm, or something that's just something whose behavior is just being determined by your environment. But rather, we're not animals. We're fundamentally different. We can think and reason. We can make decisions. We can communicate verbally. And we have a moral sense as well. And so the biblical explanation of that, and that's why this kind of naturalistic materialism just plain isn't true. We know as human beings that we're different from that we're not just, cogs in the machine, being acted on upon nature. The biblical account of creation, I think, offers a much better explanation. And it says, Genesis 1, starting with verse 26, Then God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and every other creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. So here we see that, first of all, God began by saying, Let us make man in our image. And that implies that there's a human essence that defines us as human beings. And that we're not just animals, but we were created in the image of God. And of course, there's some debate about exactly what the image of God is. But we are made in his image. And then the passage goes on to talk about how that God communicated with our first parents, our first ancestors, verbally. And so that means that we're able to communicate verbally, to think and to reason and understand. And then it says that God gave man dominion over the rest of nature. And the implication then is that we're not just animals, and we're not just a part of the physical universe, but as creatures made in the image of God, we have the ability to kind of control our environment and to bring order out of the chaos. So I think, frankly, the Bible gives a far more satisfactory explanation of life and reality than naturalistic materialism. Certainly it gives a lot better explanation of who we are as human beings and how we think and feel and reason and have a moral sense. And we live in and I think what it boils down to is that we live in a rationally ordered universe created by an intelligent supreme being. Everything has meaning and purpose. And then that means, in turn, we can find happiness and fulfillment in life only by coming into conformity with the will of our Creator. and everything else is dysfunctional, and that's what you see going on in society today. You see the the family structure falling apart, people confused about their gender, and it's because modern Western society refuses to acknowledge that we are put here on this planet by an intelligent supreme being who intended for everything to function a certain way. And frankly, atheism is a dead-end street, and doesn't offer us a useful alternative to Christianity or convincing alternative to Christianity at all. So give that some thought, and we hope to see you again in our next episode. Bye now.